Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 42, the final episode in this series on ecology. If you've been listening to this whole series from the very beginning, then you heard me introduce ecology as a field of study, as a fundamental aspect of the biological sciences. Then I explored ecology at all of its levels, from the behavior of the individual organism to the behaviors of a collective, of populations. Then I explored the species interactions that take place at the community level, followed by entire ecosystems and their integration into the greater biosphere. If you just finished listening to that most recent episode, you'll remember that I ended it by talking about water cycling and nutrient cycling, and how these geochemical processes connect all life on Earth. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the biodiversity of the planet, what that means, and how humans can work to save and preserve the biodiversity and the complex ecosystems that we have today. Alright, so the fundamental question is, what is biodiversity? The root words should give it away. Bio, meaning life, and diversity. So it basically means the diversity of life, or the variety of different kinds of organisms that exist in a given habitat, or an ecosystem, or on the entire planet. Biodiversity is relatively low in deserts, and in polar regions, and in high-altitude steppe, and in the barren expanses of open ocean. All of these areas get too little of some critical resource, which limits its habitability and reduces the number of species that can live there. Deserts get too little water and too much heat. Polar regions get too little heat, and in many places they get a lot less rain than most other areas. The open ocean has lots of water and sunlight, but it has little to no nutrients, especially deep in the open ocean. Coral reefs, in contrast, are tightly concentrated areas in the oceans with extremely high biodiversity and stunningly complex community ecologies. These coral reefs are literally like explosions of life, piercing an otherwise barren, empty, sandy ocean floor. Biodiversity can be understood at three levels of magnification. At the smallest level, there's DNA, and all of the genes in an organism, and all of the genes and alleles in a population. The diversity of genes in a gene pool are directly influential to the health of that gene pool, and the health of the individual organisms that it produces. It's important for populations and species to maintain a healthy genetic diversity, because the more alleles and traits present in a population, the more likely that population is to survive threats like predation and disease. If you imagine a population of organisms that all have really similar genes, and thus low genetic diversity, the entire population is more susceptible to disease. If a pathogen can penetrate the defenses of one host, then that pathogen has effectively nullified the genes that produce viable immune proteins and defensive structures for all of the other hosts in the population. If all of the other individuals of the population have similar genes, and thus roughly the same chemical defenses, then the pathogen will be able to easily infect the entire group, and potentially kill them all. You can contrast this with an example from medieval Europe, where some of the people who survived the bubonic plague had a random genetic predisposition towards being resistant to it. Whatever trait they happened to possess, which might be something as innocuous as part of a biomolecule bent in a new direction that makes the plague bacteria unable to bind to immune cells, well, that makes them a little less likely to be infected than those who don't have that genetic mutation. This group of survivors of the bubonic plague had gone through a bottleneck event that had killed off a huge portion of the people that had little to no genetic resistance. And because of this, those who did have that resistance now represented a much larger portion of the total surviving population than they did before the plague, than they did before the selective event. This genetic resistance to bubonic plague persists today in many of the living descendants of those particular survivors of the plague. This brings me to the next level of magnification of biodiversity, which is the species diversity. After genetic diversity, you have species diversity. Now, species diversity is the number and the ecological value of all of the species in a habitat, or in a genetic lineage. For example, humans have had numerous cousin lineages split off from the larger Homo branch, which itself split off from the ancestor species of chimps and bonobos about 6 million years ago. As far as we're aware, all of our cousin lineages, like the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, have all gone extinct. In that regard, the Homo lineage is species poor, because there's a single species left, the Homo sapien, and that's us. And so if we go extinct somehow, if there's some nuclear holocaust, or if the Earth gets baked from a coronal mass ejection event that just happens to catch us up in its sweep, and we all go extinct, then the lineage of the Homo genus will be gone forever. On the other hand, there are lineages that are species rich, or lineages that have a very large number of descendant species, all of them evolutionary cousins of one another. For example, there's 5 species of cow in the Bos genus. There's 285 species of squirrels in the family Sciuridae. There's 3,600 species of snake in the suborder Serpentis, and around 10,000 species of birds. There are some lineages with such huge species richness and incredible species diversity that we haven't even come close to cataloging them all. For example, there's more than 12,000 named species of ants out of an estimated 22,000. There's 35,000 named species of orchids, and there's more than 350,000 named species of beetles. And scientists estimate that there are thousands more species that either haven't been discovered or haven't been studied enough to be named and described yet. But species diversity isn't just the raw number of species in a lineage or in a habitat. It's the ecological value that they provide to their community. This is an important point to understand, because it reinforces the fact that life is in continual flux with all other life around it, perpetually. So the habits of one species have been shaped by evolution to fit into a greater community. This value obviously varies from species to species and habitat to habitat, but ultimately, the point is, some species have much more ecological value than others. The most striking example that I can think of, just off the top of my head, is comparing a tree to a small species of weedy plant. The weedy plant doesn't really do much. It's too small and too weak to have really that much of an effect on holding the soil together, and because it's kind of small, if an herbivore comes to eat it, it's only got a very limited amount of biochemical energy, and so that herbivore is presumably going to have to find more food elsewhere. So this little weedy plant is having a very small ecological effect. But if we look at a tree, which is this massive vegetable structure that provides shelter and food for all manner of other organisms, we can see that the tree has huge ecological value. The tree's canopy is like an upper layer that creates a little micro-habitat between the ground and the canopy itself, where you have tree-dwelling organisms and surface-dwelling organisms all interacting and doing their thing. As another example, consider a species of fly that might be one of thousands of species, barely different than hundreds of others. And so, if that particular species of fly happened to go extinct, there might not be that much effect. Other similar fly species would just fill the empty niche, and the animals that ate them would be none the wiser. Larger species, or species that provide some kind of valuable ecological service, would obviously leave a much larger imbalance in their ecosystem should they go extinct, or should they migrate out of the current habitat. The tree is such a good example that I want to dig into it a little deeper. Trees are hugely important for their ecosystems because they literally form the physical architecture that's needed by all manner of other species, like mosses and epiphytes and funguses, as well as lizards, monkeys, birds, squirrels, bats, and everything else that dwells in or on the tree. Another kind of organism with a high ecological value are apex predators, because the apex predator typically regulates the size of herbivore populations. Without predators to cull them, the population of herbivores will grow wildly as they reproduce with no fear of being killed, and they ultimately eat up all of the available vegetation. And as they all start to starve to death, they might begin to realize that they just destroyed their habitat. This brings me to the third level of biodiversity, which exists as the diversity within an ecosystem, and how that diversity provides necessary ecological services and moves chemicals through their cycles. Consider nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which provide a critically important service for plants. These bacteria take molecular nitrogen in the atmosphere and break the triple bond that holds the two nitrogen atoms together. Or in other words, they fix the nitrogen. And as they fix the nitrogen to sustain their own metabolism, as a byproduct, they create nitrogenous compounds that the plants can then metabolize. If an ecosystem loses the few bacterial species with the genes that make it able to fix nitrogen, then that function will disappear from the ecosystem. There's no other organisms left to break molecular nitrogen down into a more bioaccessible format, so plants can no longer rely on those bacteria as a source of nitrogen. But because plants get most, if not all, of their nitrogen from these bacteria, their disappearance would really screw over the plants. The plants in the habitat would most likely die, and the ecosystem would experience the catastrophic collapse of its primary producers. Nitrogen cycling would grind to a halt in this ecosystem, and the food web would be so disrupted as to be effectively destroyed. If any animals are going to survive, they're going to have to migrate somewhere else and leave this ruined habitat behind them. This example shows how all of these levels of biodiversity are integrated, how all of life is integrated and how it's all connected. At the smallest level, you have the genes that code for the proteins that can fix nitrogen. At the species level, you have the particular species of bacteria that are able to do this, that possess those genes. And then you have the upstream ecological effects of all of their nitrogen fixation on all of the other species around them. This also ties together everything that I've covered in all of the episodes before this. The biochemicals that I talked about in Series 1 and the genes that I talked about in Series 3 create the cells that I talked about in Series 2, and these create the organisms that get shaped through evolution, which I talked about in Series 4. I talked about the divergence and the diversity of species that propagated from these forces in Series 5 and in Series 6. And in this series, in Series number 7, I've been talking about how everything interacts together. I really can't emphasize enough how all living things, including you and me, are connected really deeply on a fundamental chemical basis. There's about 1.5 million species that have been named and cataloged. Only some of these have been studied, and a relatively small portion of them have been studied extensively. But it's estimated that many millions of species exist and have yet to be described, have yet to be named, or even discovered. So the question is, where are all of these species? They're not dispersed evenly across the planet. That's obvious. Recall from previous episodes when I would talk about the density of an ecosystem, or just a few minutes ago in this episode when I talked about species richness, species diversity. The density of life is highest in the geographic areas where the environmental conditions are optimal for life. So in the far north, across the vast expanses of taiga and tundra that cover Siberia and northern North America, there's relatively little life. There's a relatively small number of species. This is to say that the areas are species poor, and the few species that do live in these areas aren't very concentrated. They don't have huge, densely packed populations. They tend to be dispersed across this massive landscape. The reason that everything is so sparse up here is because that's all that the land can support. There isn't that much light, and most of the year it's really cold, and often very dry, and all of these factors make it very hard for plants to grow. When the primary producers of an ecosystem are struggling, or when they're limited by abiotic factors, they just can't support a complex ecology of primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers. There simply isn't enough chemical energy in the ecosystem to support them. This is also true in the open desert, where it's too hot and too dry for most plants to grow, and for most animals to tolerate. In both of these extreme habitats, a small number of species have adapted to thrive here, but they are few in number and scattered widely across the landscape. In contrast, consider regions like the Amazon rainforest in South America, or the Congo River Basin in Central Africa, or the jungles of Southeast Asia. All of these regions are very hot because they get a lot of light from the sun, but there's also enough humidity in the air to moderate the temperature so that it never gets too hot, like it does in the Sahara or the Australian outback. This combination of ample sunlight, steady annual temperatures, and high humidity and high rainfall all create an environment that's prime for life, and so life grows. Life grows really fast and really dense. These more hospitable regions are extremely dense with life, as you have trees that can grow very close together, with all manner of smaller plants filling in the space between, and with all manner of animals living on, in, and around the plants, using them as shelter or eating them for food. Because of this, more than half of all the species on planet Earth exist in tropical jungles, where the conditions for life are optimal. Biodiversity can be studied by looking at species richness, which, as I've said, is basically the raw number of different species in a particular region. And biodiversity can also be studied by looking at the number of endemic species in a region. An endemic species is a species that lives in one particular region and nowhere else on Earth. Areas with a higher count of endemic species generally have greater biodiversity overall. In fertile tropical areas like the Pacific Islands of Oceania and the Andes Mountains in South America, the number of endemic species of birds is really high, and this correlates directly to the total biodiversity of the regions, which are both quite high too. Across the planet, there are regions where the biodiversity of other regions overlaps, and these become a kind of locus for unique and complex species interactions that are found nowhere else, because these are the only areas where there's that particular kind of ecological overlap. Biodiversity is a critically important factor in ecology, in the health of ecosystems and habitats. If you have a complex ecosystem with lots of biodiversity, with lots of species of plant and animal and fungus and microbe, you'll have a lot of niches. You have a lot of food sources, you have a lot of shelter, there's a lot of predators and prey, and really complex species interactions. There's likely a lot of species that play really important ecological roles, or that provide some really critical service or function that perpetuates the health and stability of the ecosystem. Needless to say, biodiversity is extremely important. It's integral to the health of our habitats and ecology. But biodiversity is being threatened by human activity, by the changes that we're inducing to the planet. Mass extinction events are nature's typical tool for cleansing a landscape of life and destroying the biodiversity in a region. Meteor impacts kill off life. Volcanic eruptions kill off life. Massive wildfires and floods and outgassing events can kill off life. Uncontrolled predator activity can kill off their prey. Uncontrolled herbivore activity can kill off the plants that they feed on. Diseases can wipe out species entirely, or reduce them to such a state that they just can't sustain their numbers until they slowly die out. The number and the nature of the threats to biodiversity are quite high, but nature has not created an extinction force quite as powerful as the human species. Humans are causing extinctions at an absolutely horrifying rate, which is leading to a reduction in biodiversity that's unparalleled in any other time in the history of the planet Earth. In my series on the evolutionary history of life, I talked about the 5 primary giant mass extinctions that have defined the life on Earth. These extinctions radically altered the biodiversity present on the planet, reducing species to bottleneck conditions, if not wiping them out entirely. Those life forms that were able to survive each event would go on to reproduce, diversify, and evolve new species, recreating the lost biodiversity over millions of years. The 6th mass extinction is ongoing right now, as I speak to you through this podcast. Our behavior, our collective human behavior, from agriculture to medicine to industry, is having a profound effect on the biodiversity of the planet, reducing it in pretty much all cases. For example, we need lumber to build our houses, and we need toilet paper to wipe our asses, so we cut down forests. But this deforestation quite literally destroys the habitats of thousands and thousands of forest-dwelling species. We're driving them out of their native habitat into new regions where they either can't compete and thus face extinction, or where they thrive and become an invasive species that wreaks havoc on the habitats that they invade. We practice industry and large-scale agriculture, but these activities create pollution that destabilizes ecosystems with harmful chemicals, and some of these chemicals can alter the growth or reproduction of vulnerable species, and some of these materials can choke or poison the animals that eat them. I've talked about microbeads before, and the threat that they and other microplastics pose to animal life, and then you have other pollutants like pesticides and insecticides, which kill off insects or screw up their reproductive cycles, and which we know now is having insanely destructive downstream ecological effects, because we're seeing that insects across the planet, their populations are crashing, and that's a future disaster waiting to happen. And then you also have fertilizers from agriculture, which get washed off by the rain, which leads to nutrient contamination in downstream habitats. Even our medicines can end up polluting habitats, where a human will be prescribed a drug, and they'll take the drug, they'll metabolize some of it, and they'll excrete the rest in their urine or feces. And when this waste is flushed down the toilet, it'll find its way into rivers and streams, where some of the medicine is still biologically active and can interfere in the endocrine or reproductive cycles of other organisms. Habitat destruction is perhaps the most obvious and the most widespread effect of human development. Deforestation through logging is an obvious example of habitat destruction, but it doesn't stop there. By no means does it stop there. When we develop land for urban expansion, it typically involves the radical reconfiguration of the landscape. If we want to build in a swamp, we drain the swamp. If we want to build in a mountainous region, we level the mountains or blast holes in them. If we want to redirect a river, we'll build a dam. Now, when the swamp is drained, all of the organisms that depended on that watery, swampy environment are literally left out to dry. They suffer and die and have to go somewhere else if they want to survive. The plants that require the swamp water, like mangroves, are often outright doomed, as they have pretty much no recourse to defend themselves in this scenario. They can't get up and move because they're plants who are rooted to the ground, so if the water that they depend on is pumped out, they're up a creek without a paddle. In this respect, animals tend to fare slightly better because they can run away and move to a different habitat. But without their ideal habitat, without the habitat that evolution sculpted them to live in, their chances of survival are hugely reduced. When we level mountains to build a road or a suburb, we push out all of the animals that thrived in that mountain environment, like birds and goats and yaks. For that matter, by removing mountains, we take away all of the ecological effects that mountains have. We redirect wind patterns, and this redirected wind can affect where rain falls, where pollen goes, and where animals migrate. When we dam up a river, the river itself gets entirely redirected. All of the plants downstream from the dam get starved of the water that they've come to depend on the river for, and any fish that migrate in the stream will find themselves lost. For that matter, the redirected river cuts through new habitats, often destroying them in a flood of water. If the dam doesn't redirect the river anywhere, but instead just stops the river and holds it up, then the dam can lead to the formation of a lake, and this lake comes with its own ecological ramifications. The first thing you notice is that all of this dry land that was once covered in plants is now drowned. There's a giant lake on top of it. All of the animals that live here either drowned as well, or they were pushed out into less comfortable territory. In all of these ways, habitats get outright destroyed or radically altered by human activity. Sometimes we don't outright destroy a habitat. but we degrade it to such an extent that it can no longer support or propagate the species that live there. Sometimes this habitat degradation takes the form of interference, and other times it takes the form of fragmentation. Now, the most obvious example of interference that I can think of is light and sound pollution. This is most harmful for a species of birds, because they use both the stars to navigate and songs to communicate. So when light pollution blocks out the stars, the birds find it difficult to navigate. Sometimes they confuse light pollution from a city as a rising or a setting sun, and when this doesn't jive with their circadian rhythm, they get confused, and they become much less effective at following migratory routes, and thus their fitness drops because they're not successfully participating in all of these behavioral patterns that often lead to reproduction. Sound pollution, on the other hand, can come from almost anything that produces a lot of noise. Heavy traffic, industrial machinery, jet engine aircraft, you name it. All of these things can frighten animals and drive them out of a particular region, or they can interfere with their mating calls. It's really hard to attract a mate when you can't hear them making their mating call, and when they can't hear you either. Another mechanism for habitat degradation is called fragmentation. And this is actually really common, and it's pretty sad because you could probably pretty quickly come up with a lot of ways to prevent this, but we don't. We prioritize building highways and suburbs and all manner of other things that break up particular habitats. A fragmented habitat is one that's been literally fragmented or fractured into a bunch of smaller pieces. The most obvious way this can happen is with roads and highways. These strips of asphalt cut right through fields and forests and swampland, pretty much anything, and they divide the landscape into irregular chunks. Now, terrestrial animals are capable of crossing the road, but every time they do, they take a risk. They're taking the risk of being hit by a car. And if you've driven for any appreciable length of time, you've almost certainly seen a rabbit, or a deer, or a porcupine trying to cross the road. Perhaps as you drove by, you saw the tire tracks over their squished dead body from somebody else who hit them earlier. Or perhaps you're really unlucky and you hit a larger animal like a bear or a moose, in which case its huge bulky body would crash back into your vehicle, and you would be injured if not killed outright. Habitat fragmentation has a few nuanced effects that can seriously alter the local ecology. Consider the case of an apex predator. These organisms require a huge expanse of land to roam and hunt for prey. When their habitat gets fragmented, the predator has that much less land to roam around on. They're that much less likely to find food, or to find a mate. The end result is a drastic reduction in the number and efficacy of the apex predator. Their prey populations live unharassed, and so they can swell in numbers. And as I've talked about before, this can have numerous, serious downstream ecological effects. If you have a bunch of herbivores with no predators to cull their numbers, then the herbivores will reproduce like crazy and eat all of the available vegetation until they create a barren, empty landscape, and they all start to starve to death. Another negative consequence of habitat fragmentation is the emergence of ecological patterns called metapopulations. When you have an uninterrupted habitat, it will generally be inhabited by large populations that roam and swell across the landscape. But when the habitat is fragmented, the population is fragmented. Instead of a big group of organisms, you end up with a lot of little groups. This ecological restructuring puts species at a lot of risk, for two main reasons. First, it makes the tiny metapopulations much more susceptible to diseases and droughts and other threats to their survival. The smaller populations have less genetic diversity, and so they have less of a capacity to respond to and survive an external threat. Any kind of dangerous, random, chance event like a disease or an environmental change can come by and destroy a metapopulation quickly, whereas a larger population that's a little more cohesive would have more genetic diversity and a greater geographic distribution so as to ensure their survival. Second, these smaller, isolated metapopulations suffer from really low gene flow. They've suddenly been cut off from all the rest of their species, kind of like a tiny village community that's isolated from the rest of civilization. These villagers, and in the case of natural ecology, these plants and animals that are members of a metapopulation, are exposed to the dangers of inbreeding. Their fitness and their health will slowly degenerate as the isolated metapopulation is forced to interbreed through the circumstances of being shuttered in a fragmented sliver of habitat. The accumulating genetic load of all of this inbreeding creates an increasing relatedness in the mating individuals, which ultimately results in the random loss of allelic traits, as well as a general decrease in fitness known as inbreeding depression. All of these things make metapopulations more susceptible to diseases and threats, and much more vulnerable to extinction. Humans can also reduce biodiversity through overexploitation, which is technically defined as the unsustainable rate of extraction of wildlife from their habitat. This is most obvious in the oceans, where the collective effort of all the world's fishing fleets has depleted the oceans of numerous species. Some species of fish have had their numbers obliterated, and they struggle to maintain their existence. Other species have seen a huge reduction in size, as all of the large individuals have been fished out, leaving only the small individuals to reproduce and pass on their genes into the next generation. And so, as a result, the average size of any given species of fish, particularly a large-bodied fish like swordfish, tuna, trout, and shark, have all been decreasing steadily as a result of our overfishing. It is so important for us to understand that our behavior affects the life on this planet, and we need to understand how it affects biodiversity. The biodiversity of our world is indescribably important. We see greater production of biomass in areas with higher biodiversity, because life helps to perpetuate life, and where there's more life, like more trees, more insects, more fungus, more of everything, we see more complex food webs that are more resistant to damage, and more complex species interactions that create more dynamic, responsive ecologies. This means that resources are used more efficiently, resources are distributed more effectively, and there's a greater diversity of biological services provided to the ecosystem by the various species within it. Biological communities with higher biodiversity are more resistant to drought, to disease, to wildfire, to pretty much any threat that you can think of. Biodiversity and the inherent dynamism of a wide variety of species brings a degree of stability to an ecosystem that nothing else can rival. It's incredibly important that we work hard to preserve what biodiversity remains on the planet Earth, and it's important that we try to restore biodiversity to areas where it's been reduced. One method that I'm particularly fond of is called a wildlife corridor. Land is often fragmented around cities, as we build out roads and railways and other kinds of land development. As I've described, this can impede the movement of animals and have many negative downstream effects. But with a wildlife corridor, these problems can be largely averted. These corridors are like deliberately created and maintained animal highways, like a bridge that has grass and trees covering it. Instead of being a bridge for humans and human vehicles, these wildlife corridors are like bridges for animals. They give them an avenue for transport that bypasses the things that have fragmented their habitat, like roads and railways. If you have a large road that bisects a forest and fragments it into two smaller forests, a wildlife corridor, or several of them along the road, could take the form of wide bridges, or a series of bridges over the roadway, wherein the animals native to the forest can cross back and forth. In this way, the effect of fragmentation is lessened, as predators can still roam around a wide expanse of land, grazing animals can maintain their migration routes, and gene flow can still be maintained between populations that would have otherwise been separated by the road. This isn't a perfect idea, as we've seen that in some cases predators have learned to just hang out by the wildlife corridor because they've learned that it's a pinch point for migrating herbivores, And while the wildlife corridor isn't a perfect solution, it's certainly better than nothing. It's certainly better than just leaving the habitat fragmented and doing nothing about it. It's ideas like this that will help preserve our world's biodiversity. Ideas that are elegant and aesthetic, and yet functional and reasonably effective. Coming up with new ideas for maintaining and preserving biodiversity is a booming field in the biological sciences, and it's something that you can do right at home. All you need is a little bit of background knowledge and some creative thinking, and you're ready to start coming up with ways to save the world. Alright, now we're pretty much near the end of this episode, but there's one more point I want to communicate. If everything that I've discussed so far this episode has not quite convinced you of the value of biodiversity, if you think that my arguments might be a little abstract and maybe a little preachy, like maybe, hey, this guy is quite the environmentalist, what a bunny hugger, haha, okay, fair enough. If none of this has convinced you so far that biodiversity is incredibly important, then consider this. Every living organism is a biochemical superstructure, and that superstructure, being composed of biochemicals, includes a breathtaking variety of enzymes and other biocompounds that have some kind of reactive property that can be used somehow in biochemistry. Virtually every part of every organism has molecules like this within it, be it the blood of a polar bear, the saliva of a Komodo dragon, the poison of a tree frog, the exudates from a plant, the psychedelic compounds produced by some kinds of fungus, or the fluids that any kind of organism happens to produce. All of this stuff, all of these different biochemicals, are the things that we've built our civilization on. All modern medicine comes from the natural world. All of our modern medicine that we use to save millions of lives across the world every year, all of these chemicals that we use are derivatives, or straight purified extracts from some kind of organism, be it a plant or an animal that produces some valuable metabolite or enzyme or anything that we can use medicinally. Furthermore, all kinds of plants and animals have fibers in their tissues, molecular fibers, and we extract these fibers and modify them to produce all manner of different substances, from rubbers to plastics. It's not hyperbolic in any way to say that our modern civilization is fundamentally built off of the technologies, medicines, and products that we can create from the naturally existing things in the world all around us. If any particular organism goes extinct, then its genes and its metabolites and its enzymes and its fluids and anything that we could study and use to enhance our own existence, all of that is gone forever when that organism goes extinct. And so when we build our civilization out in this way that's so destructive and so invasive to everything else in the world, we are destroying biodiversity. We are destroying the raw chemical resources that we've used to build the civilization in the first place. When you look at it from this perspective, it becomes quite clear how the loss of biodiversity represents an existential threat to human civilization. Alright, well, on that note, I hope you enjoyed this episode on biodiversity, and I hope you learned something that you found cool and interesting. I really can't stress enough how important biodiversity is to the health and the vitality of our planet, and how important biodiversity is to us pragmatically, culturally, recreationally, and existentially. We depend on biodiversity for so many things, but because the nature of ecology can be so complicated, and the value of biodiversity so nuanced and subtle, that it's easy for us to overlook it or to underestimate its importance. Ideally, we can create a civilization that exists in sustainable harmony with the world around us, preserving and encouraging biodiversity wherever possible. Of course, that depends on how we react to the problems caused by climate change, and how we transition our civilization to use more sustainable energy sources, and to have more sustainable lifestyle practices. These are all problems that young people and all future generations will have to deal with. So hopefully, as a species, as a civilization, hopefully we're up to the task. If you like this episode, hit the like button. If you like all my content and you want to see more, hit the subscribe button. And as always, thanks for listening.